Hello everyone, Kurt over here, and welcome back to another episode from Holfeder Labs. Today we continue on with the Armored Sword section within Fiore's manuscripts, and we're going to be looking at the second posta, the Vera Croce, the True Cross. Now, the Vera Croce is one that is, again, one that I believe is an offline position, as was shown within some of the posture structures. And I also described about how it is a defensive one, but it's also charged to be very offensive, depending upon how you can use it. And we're going to explore that today. But also with this right here, it also talks about how it has passing, crossing, and striking are foundational portions when it comes down to the art. And even though he talks about this right here for just this posta, I believe he is talking about the totality of what it comes down to when it comes down to armor. And we're going to look at all of that. But before we begin, please, if you haven't done so already, like, subscribe, and share with a friend out there. And please share this video. I'd like to make sure that people that are interested in armor or in Fiore's abrazare have content that they can look at, and we'd like to have them join us here within this adventure of the 14th century practice of arms. If you have a comment or thoughts on this as you're watching it, please leave it below. Love to hear what your thoughts on this right here, whether you're new to abrazare or if you're a seasoned practitioner. Love to have that, and love to hear what can help this channel grow, as well as the perspective of this martial art traditions. So now that I've done that right there, let's get into it.
So this week we're going to continue on with another half sword or armored sword grip, and we're talking about the Posta de Vera Croce. This is one right here that is depicted that is very interesting to me because it's something that is once again an offline guard that hides the sword behind. It utilizes elements of dente di cingaro, this position, as it holds and maintains a structure. So again, we talk about that position structure of dente di cingaro. We may be right here in a position that's holding this. One thing about this right here, and this is another factor as to why I started seeing posta and guardia as two things of the same thing, is that I may not want to hold this because it's weighing down the arm. I might be in a posta here, shift up, and cross things here. And again, what I do, I use dente di cingaro, the hooking of the arm, to create this kind of concept. So we can use Posta de Vera, obviously, to start off, and then to shift up into a crossing position. To make this position right here, again, when it's depicted, we see it as such. This is how I tend to see Vera Croce, is that once again, we're seeing that offline position where I'm like this, the tip is up, and I have the sword across this way here. He makes the concept about covering, passing, covering, and striking. And that right there, how the art is about that. Which I think is very interesting here because he's talking about, in my opinion, rotational nodes of action, which goes back to the defensive things we talked about a few episodes ago. So this position here, he says I won't miss my mark, is very interesting because again, if you start talking about on the target, if I am passing forward with this, so I am passing, covering, and striking. That concept right there means I have shifted into a direction either towards an opponent, remember largo and stretto, and I have bound or broke against this. Depending on what I have on my hands here, it could mean many different things. This could be I come across and bind it and set it in because the edge works, and then I'm working in the edge against the flat to find my thrust. This position right here is incredibly deft because it allows crossing it from the front to the body here, and there's a thrust that's right on line. I can use this in any form or fashion, however. It's not just limited to the high thrusting. As we see within many of the manuscripts, guy getting thrust to the face, or the armpit, or whatever, it doesn't necessarily matter. It doesn't have to just be those regions. It could be anywhere. So if the person is thrusting low, there's nothing saying that I can't turn and pass and thrust into the low groin. There's nothing saying I can't transition this into the previous one of the Posta de Vera Serpentina and then fight out of that position. It's just saying that out of these right here, we have a tradition of being able to utilize rotation, covering, and striking together. Which again, with passing, it allows for me, so I can utilize this, but again, depending on what my weight is and what my opponent is, again, if I'm back, passing would require me to volta and then to get to the other side of play, which means we are utilizing mezzovolta. This allows the rotation pieces. On one of those, you can see how I didn't have my footing properly and I almost fell forward. Again, one of the considerations when it comes down to passing with armor. So let's talk a little bit about how we might make this position. I already cued in a little bit right here because Posta de Vera serpentina, I could be here, there's your thrust, or here, I might be in the sword in one hand, and either way, just finding this, I can put myself into position. If I come down, strike the sword in one hand, I basically have the ability to rotate down, set in place, and then I have a thrust that allows me different actions of approach in on a target. This is a spot right here that's very easy to replicate because, again, I have not done much with my hands. The lead hand here is stabilized. If I have the long 6 dissimilar guard where I can shoot long at somebody, I'm still falling back to this. I can still thrust here and pass back and be able to continue fighting in that rotational fashion. So remember, what he says about this is passing, covering, striking. So movement, then covering, then striking. Which is get out of the way, cover it, and then strike. Which is very important. And why is that possible? Because of the usage of armor. So that's what it really boils down to when it comes to the Vera Crose. The Vera Crose to me is a very useful guard. And again, the thing that makes it useful is not just to be able to rotate, because you can do that with all of these. And Fiore's commentary about passing, covering, striking, I don't believe just limits itself to that one play, but in general, because he says it's about the totality of the art. And because we have that in space, that means that every last one of these right here, by moving, covering, striking, that's the best way to be able to move against somebody and to find the point in, to drive in, and to find other actions to go against them. That also allows us to go from the bind and the break, and depending on the type of sword that you have, and that allows dominance of a center line where this is much more stronger than this, to be able to fight into the area or to transition out, as you'll see in future plays, within the sword and armor section.
So as you can see with the video, Vera Crose is, it's an offline position that to me sometimes also really resembles the sword in one hand posture, right? So that sword in one hand posta that, depending on how you want to break it down to what it is or is not, he's offline here and he's covered and he's using his position there to be able to strike, counter, and do other things out of with rotational nodes. The Vera Crose itself is incredibly dynamic, and if used properly, it has some great outcomes that I think in many cases allow us to explore how the rotational concept of binding works. Something that I didn't put in the video here, but in previous years where I had done training with Vera Crose, I had noticed that a lot of people they'll bind and then they'll couch. And couching, I have not found evidence, at least within Fiore's Getty. I have not seen evidence of couching so much. I actually don't think that Fiore couches unless you're talking about a lance on top of a horse, and I believe that's for a reason when it comes down to the usage of arms and whatnot. And I'll talk about that in a second. But the Vera Crose itself, I believe, is a way of being able to, once again, if the blade is angled in a way that is, like, say, the flat is towards the person, then as a strike comes in, I can bind, either I can break or I can bind against an incoming shot. And that kind of movement right there means that I'm able to control, once we start getting into different types of plays and sequences that explore out of the armored sections that we'll see later on. So again, like that right there is a big part about this, because when it comes down to armor, and as we'll see later on, when Fiore makes a comment about I've stabbed you, I've given you a few thrusts, but you have good armor, and therefore I'm going to give you a turn and see if your armor is as good on the back as it is in the front. I don't necessarily think that Fiore has to couch a lot of his shots, because I don't think that's what he's trying to do as far as to drive into certain points. I don't know the evolution of chainmail throughout the period of time. I can only imagine that as history progressed, that it became much more robust and probably a little bit more intricate, but I could be wrong on that. So I don't know why the Germans choose the couch and why Fiore doesn't appear to be doing any type of couching whatsoever. I think partially it could be because maybe the difference in technologies as far as armor is concerned. But I think that's one of the things about the Vera Crose that I actually really like, is that it's more placed into a spot where it can pass and turn off, and then it can strike. And that right there is a huge semblance of it, because again, as I pass and turn off and stick, the lead hand, at least based upon how it's depicted, which looks like he's kind of holding like this, and the tip's going out to his finger, out of his fingers, is that essentially that means that this hand I can let go and then start going into grapples really, really fast. Not that I couldn't do that with the low serpent or other positions, but just because it's out here, it's longer, and then I have access to go in direction of that arm. And it's less about trying to pin through, it's more about trying to put a point on, which allows for shifting possibilities, which will be talked about later on. So the last thing I really wanted to talk about was the passing, crossing, and striking, and how that right there, the art requires that. Passing, crossing, and striking. And I want to say that personally, this right here, I believe, is a nod to not just this play and not just armor, but it is a nod to everything. Because everything that he has done up until this point has always been a passing, crossing, and striking. A term we utilize in our classes is cover, stifle, turn. Part of covering means is to get out of the way or to move into the way at an appropriate angle. So by passing offline, we think about all the things here with one accrescimento offline, I've chosen to step offline, make a cover, and then to bind. A lot of times there's a discussion in the modern era that, well, if you step first, then put your sword out, that there's a great likelihood that you're going to get stuck. This is absolutely true. However, this is where I think that we may be conflating some of the notions of what Fiore's talking about in his time period and what we may be experiencing with modern sports. By being able to step into a blow or step away from a blow, that means that there's a distance right there. That means that there's a mental understanding that I have time to maneuver in these crossings. And because I have time to be able to rotate and maneuver in so many different types of directions, and because there's consequences for edge-on-edge biting, then there is a distance that needs to be maintained, and it's much more about that circular action. Again, throughout this manuscript, it's always been with an accrescimento, I can step offline, make the cover, and then move in. And that right there with the Vera Crose, because of this position, that's why I say it looks very similar to the sword in one hand, because as that section talks about, I can also let go, come up to a sword in one hand, and start playing out that in different kind of contexts. A little bit long-winded today, but I really wanted to get that out because I think it's interesting that he puts it here, and I feel like that's a reminder that his whole point is don't just put the sword out and step. For this right here, you must step and then move with the sword at the same time, which I know some people may have issue with, but at the same time too, when there's an understanding of distance that's necessitated for these things, to quote Lichtenauer, everything has length and measure, as in Langum Massa, well, then that means that both people are playing with this, and they're not experimenting. These are just rules of understanding of combat. It's not an experiment to try to figure out a text. It's just how fighting goes. So again, that's all it's going to do for this video right here. Thanks for stopping by, everybody. I appreciate you doing so. Leave a comment below. Let me know what your thoughts about this go. I mean, like I said, I think this is really kind of cool that they have this connection point here with Vera Crose, the true cross. Maybe that's a hidden thing right there that he's trying to say, like, hey, this is the concept right here that plays within unarmored, and it also, I'm showing that it goes into armored as well. I don't know. You let me know what your thoughts are out there, everybody. I appreciate you stopping by. And as always, please, until I see you, stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I'll see you all soon.